Hello, Endeavor here. Before I begin this second video in my series, Lies of the Enlightenment, I'd like to make some clarifications on what I intend to do with this series. I want to be clear that I don't see the Enlightenment as a monolith. I understand that different ideas came from different writers who very often disagreed with each other. I also want to make it clear that I don't consider everything that came out of the Enlightenment to be bad. For example, I rather liked Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes. I liked some of the ideas of Locke, but I disliked others, while figures like Rousseau or Mill I have almost an entirely negative opinion of. But I don't want to paint them all with a broad brush. That is why each video will be addressing one particular argument that came out of the Enlightenment, and how it affects our understanding of society today. While I do think John Locke had some good ideas, in this video I'll be taking on an idea that he and many other Enlightenment thinkers put forward that I cannot agree with. That is the concept of the consent of the governed. To understand where this concept comes from, you need to understand another concept that was of great debate during the Enlightenment: the social contract. The social contract is a theory on the origins of governance and the relationship between the state and the individual. It states that man gave up his state of nature to enter into a civil society with laws and governance. The social contract is an agreement between the people and the government, that in return for respecting the authority of the government and granting it a monopoly on the use of force, the government works to defend the life, liberty, and property of the people. Now, three major Enlightenment-era philosophers that discussed the social contract were Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Hobbes, whom, as you can probably tell from my previous video, I'm most inclined to agree with, stated that man in nature was brutal and savage. He believed that in order to avoid the chaos of the state of nature, man gave power to a sovereign governing entity, which in return would bring about order. Seeing man as brutal in nature, the sovereign couldn't guarantee many rights beyond safety. Further rights beyond that could only exist under certain circumstances. Hobbes advocated for absolute monarchy. It's important to note that he wasn't calling for totalitarianism. What he was saying was that since man in nature was so violent, he didn't have to sacrifice much by entering into civil society, so all that the government was obligated to provide was order. A healthy society would protect people's life, liberty, and property, but according to Hobbes, this could not be guaranteed. Locke had a somewhat different take on the social contract. He argued that man in nature did have natural rights to life, liberty, and property, which they formed a state and a government to protect. Since the people gave authority to a government, they should, according to Locke, be ruled only by a government they consent to. This principle was key in the development of liberal democracy. Rousseau goes a step further than Locke. He makes the claim that man in nature is inherently good. He starts his essay on the social contract with the famous quote, "Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains." Since, according to Rousseau, man in nature had liberty, only popular sovereignty is legitimate, because man gave up his natural liberty to the government. This is also a principle used to argue for democracy, based on the collective will of the populace. Rousseau actually made the claim that this could be better represented by direct democracy than representative democracy. The argument that Locke and Rousseau give is that since man gave up his natural-born freedom to enter into civil society, he can only legitimately be ruled by a government that he consents to. If a government infringes upon the natural rights of the people, they have the right to remove the government. The case for democracy is made on the basis that it allows people to elect their government, hence giving them the consent of the governed. Now, my objection to this concept is not necessarily that I think it's a bad idea in theory. My objection is that it fails to understand how power is actually wielded within civil society. The democratic system in no way provides the populace the ability to determine the power structure under which they are ruled. And the notion that a democratic government rules by the consent of the populace and in any way reflects their will is completely false. To understand why this is the case, we need to understand what people in civil society are really ruled by. People are ruled by power. Now, what exactly is power? Power is the ability to get people to conform to your will, to get them to do what you want them to and to not do what you don't want them to reward those who conform or punish those who dissent. And the power structure under which civil society is governed goes far beyond the elected officials of said society. In fact, they are not above this rule, because power is wielded by things like cultural norms, religious institutions, intellectual thought, media outlets, and of course, financial power. These organs of influence form what is a wider societal consensus under which the society is governed. They have the ability to instill a worldview into the populace, pressure them into living what's deemed an acceptable lifestyle, and have them respect the authority structure as a whole. And this is not something the populace consents to. It's imposed from the top down. The officials that the voters in a democracy elect are still subject to this rule and act more in accordance to this force than they do the will of their constituencies. Likewise, the ability to change the power structure of a civil society is much more difficult than simply voting one government out of office and voting another one in, because both exist in the context of a wider societal consensus, with the same organs of influence in place, applying pressures upon them. They set the boundaries of the Overton window. Sure, two different political parties might have slightly different policies, but they exist under the same paradigm, and in a democracy, there isn't that much that you can do to change this, since the aforementioned positions of power are largely unelected. And there really is no way to refuse to consent to authority in this civil society, short of escaping into the woods and isolating yourself from the rest of society as a whole, at least without being met with some sort of resistance from the power structure, because no social order would allow its own destruction. Those with power, the ability to get people to conform to their will, would do all they could in order to maintain their position as of authority. To illustrate this, let's compare and contrast a pre-Enlightenment society with a post-Enlightenment one. Let's take France in the 17th century under the reign of Louis XIV for an example. He was an absolute monarch. All power was concentrated in the king. He famously said, "I am the state," and there was no denying who had power in France. It was Louis. And the king had enormous power over the metapolitical direction of France. For example, Louis revoked the Edict of Nantes and made the Catholic Church the only religion allowed in France. So all religious practices had to be Catholic, and the French populace had no say over this. Trying to undermine the king's absolute rule would have been considered treason. Now, it's untrue that absolute monarchies were totalitarian. In fact, the state was a lot less involved in people's lives back then than it is today. Now let's compare that to a post-Enlightenment society. Let's say America in the 19th century, circa 1850. They had implemented many of the values of the Enlightenment. The United States Constitution was heavily influenced by the writings of John Locke. It was a democracy where citizens could elect members of Congress. But this certainly did not mean the United States did not have an unelected power structure under which the populace had no choice but to submit. For example, the United States was officially a secular nation. The First Amendment prohibited the establishment of a state religion by law. However, it was a deeply religious country at the time, and though the church didn't have legal power, it still wielded an enormous amount of cultural power. People were raised under Christian values and lived in accordance to them. Though they weren't legally enforced as they were in Louis XIV's France, they were enforced by social norms, which anyone who wanted to be a respectable member of society needed to follow. Some states even had blasphemy laws. So even though it was officially a secular nation at the time, someone who advocated Satanism wouldn't be able to hold a position of power in 1850. They'd create a public outrage, they'd be socially ostracized, and barred from any influential institution. What were some other influential cultural forces at the time? America had a frontiersman culture. The expansion westward was driven by this spirit. Manifest destiny was the belief that America had a duty to settle the West. It was something deeply rooted in their culture. People were also extremely ethnocentric back then, so things like miscegenation were extremely taboo. And just like in every civil society, capital was extremely influential. This was the driving force behind the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. The point I'm trying to make is that even liberal democracies are still subject to a metapolitical, cultural, and economic power structure, which largely determines the direction they go as a society. And it's not really something that's decided upon through the democratic process. Likewise, the power structure of a liberal democracy will enforce itself just like an absolute monarchy. Say for instance, in 19th century America, what if there was a portion of the population that were unhappy with the direction America was going and withdrew their consent to be governed by it? Let's say then they voted to remove themselves from its power structure. Well, that did happen in the South in the 1860s. Did this democracy, which allegedly ran on the consent of the governed, allow them to do so? No, they considered it treason. The federal government fought a long and bloody civil war to crush the rebellion. because no civil society that wishes to survive can allow its authority to be undermined. So the federal government asserted its power by force. Now, this is not meant to be a criticism of America in the 19th century, nor is it meant to be a criticism of France under absolutism. One had a centralized metapolitical power structure, and one had a decentralized one, but both had one nonetheless, and that's not a bad thing. I simply believe that this is the nature of power. And if a social order is conducive to the long-term health of a civilization, then having a power structure that enforces it is beneficial. So in my opinion, the fact that they didn't live under modern liberal values is a good thing. The point is, though, that democracy does not give a populace the ability to decide the direction their civilization goes in, like the Enlightenment thinkers claim it does. Metapolitics is the driving force behind the course of civilizations over long periods of time. Power is wielded by numerous unelected organs of influence, under which those in a democratic society are still under the influence of. And again, this doesn't necessarily result in totalitarianism. If the social order is aligned with human nature, then it will likely create a freer society where the state doesn't need to interfere with people's lives. Now let's look at the modern West. Why is this lie of the Enlightenment so detrimental to us today? Because it gives the liberal democratic order under which the West is ruled today a false sense of legitimacy. That the power structure under which we live is by the consent of us, the governed, and that we have the ability to change it through the democratic process. For anyone on the dissident right who sees the West headed in the wrong direction, ruled by corrupt globalist elites, we must understand the nature of the power structure that rules us today, because it's certainly one that we are not in control of, and it all comes down to power, the ability to make people conform to your will. So what are some of the organs of influence governing the West today? The media. Multi-billion-dollar corporations which control the means of information distribution. They have the ability to craft a narrative which is sold to the wider public as the objective truth. These corporations can decide what they report on, how they portray the events, and tell you how you're supposed to think about them. And now, with social media becoming the public space, tech companies have massive control over the distribution of information. They have the ability to decide what someone can and can't say. And if you're advancing a narrative that they don't approve of, they can simply deny you access to their platform. The education system, the conditioning under which every member of society must undergo from their childhood all the way to adulthood. Public education teaches the youth from their youngest age how they're supposed to understand the world, while higher education instills the desired worldview into those who will make up the positions of power in the future. The Academy has the ability to deem sources of information credible or not credible, since after all, they're the educated ones. And most of all, money power. Corporations, lobby groups, NGOs, banks. Capital has the ability to determine how society's resources are allocated. They decide who gets funding and who does not. And all of these have the ability to bankroll the societal changes they want to see. These are the various organs of influence exerting power over the Western liberal democracies today, none of which are democratically elected. And it just so happens that the vast majority of these bodies are in support of the cause of progressive globalism. They form what Mencius Moldbug referred to as the cathedral, the ideological consensus held by the intelligentsia. That's why our culture today is dominated by progressivism, because it's the societal direction that the elites in power want to push. These various arms of the cathedral wield far more power over the lives of individuals than any elected official does. While the government has the ability to govern by force, the cathedral has the ability to govern by soft power. This decentralized yet ideologically uniform governing force has the ability to put forth a societal narrative that forms the West's understanding of good and evil. The cathedral sets the boundaries of the Overton window, deciding which opinions are acceptable and which ones are not. It has the ability to control people, not through force, but through social shaming and economic intimidation, by labeling dissenters fascists and threatening their employment. The cathedral has the ability to run a media smear campaign against a public figure who steps out of line. It has the ability to suppress scientific evidence that contradicts its narratives, and deem those who pursue it racist. And most of all, it has the ability to lobby politicians for the policies the elites want to enact. This is how power is actually wielded in the West today. And this is by no means by the consent of the governed population, nor does the democratic system provide the populace the ability to change this. You can vote Trump out of the White House, but you can't vote Jon Stewart out of the media. You can't vote Susan Wojcicki out of the tech industry. You can't vote Noam Chomsky out of the academy. Under liberalism, you can vote to replace politicians, but you can't vote to replace the media, the education system, the corporations, and these bodies exercise much more power over the individual in their day-to-day life than their local government does. To illustrate this, let's take a look at the life of a theoretical man. Let's say he's a middle-aged white man with a family of 4 working a corporate job in a cosmopolitan city, Los Angeles for example. Let's say he's unhappy with his increasing costs of living and stagnant wages. He feels like there's been a loss of community and social cohesion in Los Angeles with the influx of migrants from South America. He's a socially conservative man and laments the lack of morality in modern society. He likewise is fed up with PC culture and the narratives being forced by the media. So he voted for Trump in 2016. Now, anyone who hasn't been living under a rock for the past decade knows this man would not be able to be public about his beliefs in any meaningful way. If he expressed dissatisfaction with things like mass immigration, affirmative action, or the LGBT movement, he'd be destroyed in a modern progressive corporate environment. He'd be deemed a heretic against the dominant progressive culture. He'd be socially ostracized, lose out on career opportunities, and very possibly be fired. So he has almost no choice but to give into it, or at least not make his views public. This is cultural power being exerted, which is really backed up by the financial power of woke capital. But he voted for Trump, and Trump won. Would that change anything? Having voted against the cultural consensus and having won, could he now be public about his views post-2016? No. Corporate America has doubled down on wokeness in the era of Trump. He'd be even less safe now expressing his views than he would have before 2016. This is how the cathedral exerts its power over Westerners, and democracy does not change that. And if you want some real-world examples of this, look no further than Brendan Eich. He was the creator of JavaScript and the co-founder of the Mozilla Corporation. In 2014, he was forced to resign as CEO of Mozilla when it was revealed that 6 years earlier, he had donated to California Proposition 8, a referendum against the legalization of same-sex marriage in California, which was successful. In 2008, California voted against same-sex marriage. But despite Brendan Eich being the CEO of Mozilla and only privately having donated $1,000 to a campaign with popular Democratic support, activists, the media, and corporate power was able to pressure him to resign. And despite Proposition 8 being successful, as we all know, it was overturned several years later and same-sex marriage was legalized in California. That's the power of the cathedral at work. And there's plenty of examples of heretics convicted of wrongthink. James Watson, Charles Murray, James Damore, Lindsay Shepherd, and many, many more. Going back to this lie of the Enlightenment, the idea that democracy grants people the ability to consent to their governance and that the government is a manifestation of their will is quite dubious. Because it tricks people into believing that they control political power, when real power is in the hands of the cathedral. So it gives the powers that be a false sense of legitimacy and keeps people under the impression that they are in charge. But like Bane from The Dark Knight Rises, I must ask, do you feel in charge? I'll borrow an argument from the YouTuber Charlemagne that an absolute monarchy might actually give people a greater ability to force societal change. Because under a monarch, you would at least be able to identify where the power was coming from. People could direct their discontent towards the source of power. Under liberalism, however, we're ruled by this dark power which is self-enforcing and hard to pin down. It's difficult for people to force change when the power structure they're ruled under is so decentralized. Even in the abstract, I believe that the idea that democracy grants legitimacy through the consent of the governed is false. My objection to the powers that be today is not that they reign undemocratically. Again, I believe that this is just the nature of power. My objection is that the societal consensus that they're imposing is anti-human and designed to destroy the West. The reason that the cathedral is drifting closer and closer to totalitarianism isn't because it's undemocratic. It's because the social order they're trying to enforce is anti-human and requires control over people's lives in order to maintain. My goal isn't to achieve real democracy, because I doubt that's even possible. My goal is to replace the destructive globalist order with a more stable and healthy order. But it takes more than just winning an election to do that. It's a game of meta-politics. I still think people should vote, but it's not going to deliver us a victory. In order to change the direction of society, there needs to be a new consensus, and the organs of influence must be replaced. That's a lot harder than winning one election. And in order to make change, we must first understand the nature of power, because democracy does not put it in our hands. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and follow me on Twitter. If you'd like to join my new Discord community, or you'd like to support the channel, you can now do so. Links are down below. Thank you for listening. Till next time, endeavor.